I think everybody who visits the National Museum of the United States Air Force here at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, has a favorite aircraft, maybe one that they're connected to personally or that their family history is connected to, and this is one of mine. Now, don't call this a Boeing B-29 because this isn't. And even though my dad worked on the B-29 Superfortress when it was developed at Boeing during World War II, this is a later and greatly improved version of the B-29 called the B-50 Superfortress. Now, one of the things that history doesn't remember very well about the B-29 Superfortress is that while we tend to think of it as a fantastic aircraft that helped end World War II, and it had a lot of problems. Most notably, its R-3350 engines that were prone to overheating. Now, on this later version of the B-29 Superfortress, which has an enormous amount of changes, so many so that it was redesignated the B-50, this aircraft is completely re-engined. So let's take a look at some of the changes on this aircraft. Let me walk you through some of them. And this is part of the reason why I love this plane. Now, first of all, when you look closely at the B-50's nose, it's a good bit different than the B-29 Superfortress. You see this flat surface up here at the nose that enables the bombardier to see out of the aircraft better. On the B-29 Superfortress, the entire nose was rounded glass, and it created some distortion that mainly created problems for pilots, but also for bombardiers to a small degree. So on the B-50, you see this flat surface on the nose of the aircraft. But there's many more changes. Now, as I mentioned, one of the biggest issues with the B-29 was engine overheating. On the B-50, they switched from the Wright R-3350 Cyclone engines to a completely different engine. And in addition to there being completely different engines, you can see that the nacelles are different than the B-29 Superfortress. There's a great big intake underneath the nacelles on this aircraft that helps with cooling, removing heat from the inside of the nacelle generated by the engine. But there's also an interesting improvement to the propellers. You can see when we get really close to the propellers that the vanes of the propellers are very thick in this yellow portion close to the nacelle. That performs a number of functions that includes driving more airflow through the engine nacelle to aid in cooling, which is also pretty interesting. And man, you know, every time I look at these propellers and these engines, I'm impressed by just how enormous they are. Later versions of the KB-50 and the B-50 Superfortress actually had a jet engine that was mounted underneath the wing about right here. This example doesn't have that, but I want to show you another difference between the B-50 and the B-29 Superfortress, and it's this back here. The tail of the B-50 is much higher than it is on the B-29. And my impression, or based on what I've read about the B-50 and the B-29, is that making the rudder taller on the B-50 made it fly a little easier. It was slightly more responsive and steered slightly better. But this is an incredibly beautiful airplane, and boy, I'm proud to say, you know, my own father had a small hand, along with many, many other people at Boeing and their Renton plant in Seattle, Washington during World War II, in helping to design the original B-29 Superfortress that led to the development of this just incredible aircraft, the B-50 Superfortress. Everybody visits the B-29 in the World War II gallery boxcar because it's one of the famous nuclear strike aircraft, while the B-50 sits over here maybe a little bit lonely. So I always like to pop in here and say something about the greatly improved B-50 Superfortress. Look at those cool engines and those new propellers.